Unspeakable horrors unfolded behind closed doors in a seemingly ordinary family home. The Dowell sisters' twisted relationship with their father would shock a nation and rewrite medical textbooks on the devastating effects of inbreeding. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Dowell homestead stood like a sentinel atop the highest ridge in Taney County, Missouri, its weathered clapboards visible for miles across the undulating Ozark landscape. The farm had always maintained a certain distance from the bustling life of Springfield and the growing attractions of Branson. Even before tragedy struck, Elias Dowell and his family were known more by reputation than presence. Hard-working, God-fearing, and intensely private. When Margaret Dowell succumbed to pneumonia in the bitter winter of 1897, something fundamental changed in the household. The funeral was brief, attended by a handful of neighbors who stood awkwardly around a simple wooden cross driven into the frozen ground. Elias, a tall man with calloused hands and a face carved by years of working the unforgiving land, accepted condolences with stiff nods before ushering his daughters back to their wagon. "We'll manage on our own now," he told Reverend John Carter, who had offered to arrange meals from the church ladies. The preacher noticed how Eliza and Clara Dowell, 14 and 12 at the time, kept their eyes downcast, their matching dark braids falling forward to shield their pale faces. Within weeks, the Dowell farm began its transformation from merely remote to deliberately isolated. Elias withdrew his daughters from the one-room schoolhouse where they had been diligent students. "I'll teach them what they need to know," he informed the schoolmistress curtly. The girls, once known for their sweet singing voices during Sunday services, stopped appearing at Springfield Baptist Church altogether. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to seeing the Dowell sisters walking the dirt path to school or selling eggs at the Saturday market in Branson now caught only fleeting glimpses of them hanging laundry or tending the kitchen garden. The farm itself began to reflect this withdrawal. The once welcoming front porch accumulated fallen leaves, the gate remained perpetually closed, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains even during the brightest summer days. By autumn, the transformation was complete. The Dowell farm became a place where lamps burned until the early hours, visible as distant pinpricks of light to farmers returning late from town. The occasional sound of a fiddle, Elias had once played at community gatherings, drifted down the ridge, but it carried a mournful quality that made listeners quicken their pace. "Those poor girls," whispered Sarah Fields, the midwife, to her husband one evening. "Grief does strange things to a man, but to cut those children off from everyone who might comfort them." The community's concern gradually gave way to unease, then to whispered speculation. The Dowell sisters were fading from memory, becoming more legend than neighbors, their voices silenced and their lives hidden behind the walls of that ridgetop farmhouse that seemed to grow more foreboding with each passing season. The winter of 1897 had barely loosened its grip on the Ozarks when the first signs of the Dowell family's retreat from society became evident. 3 months after they had laid Margaret Dowell to rest beneath a simple wooden cross on the windswept ridge, her daughters' names vanished from the school ledgers as silently as morning mist from the valleys below. Eliza and Clara Dowell, once familiar faces at the one-room schoolhouse, were suddenly absent from their usual bench by the window. Their father, Elias Dowell, when confronted by Reverend John Carter during a chance encounter in Springfield, muttered something about providing proper education at home. The widower's eyes never met the minister's gaze as he spoke, his weathered hands nervously twisting the brim of his hat. "The girls need their father's guidance now," Elias had insisted, his voice barely audible above the bustle of the general store. "Book learning can wait until their grief settles." Yet those who occasionally ventured up the winding path to the Dowell farmhouse noted the conspicuous absence of any educational materials. Samuel Turner, a traveling peddler who supplied candles and basic provisions to the more remote homesteads, remarked to the proprietor of the Branson General Store that he'd never seen a single book, slate, or chalk piece during his monthly visits to the ridgetop dwelling. "Just candles," Turner had said, counting his coins. More candles than a family of 3 could possibly need. And the girls? Never a word from them, just standing in the shadows while their father conducts business. The local schoolmistress, Ruby Carmichael, concerned about her former pupils, had taken it upon herself to visit the Dowell property one crisp Sunday afternoon. The young teacher had prepared a small package of readers and arithmetic primers, hoping to assist with the girls' home education. "Mr. Dowell," she had called, standing at the weathered porch steps, "I've brought some materials for Eliza and Clara's studies." The door had opened just enough for Elias's gaunt face to appear in the narrow gap. Behind him, Ruby thought she glimpsed movement, perhaps one of the sisters, but couldn't be certain. "We need nothing," he had stated flatly before closing the door with such finality that the sound echoed across the yard. As weeks turned to months, the community's initial concern gradually transformed into a collective unease. Neighbors who had once freely discussed the Dowell girls now lowered their voices when the subject arose. At church gatherings and market days, their absence became an uncomfortable void that no one quite knew how to address. The silence from the ridge grew heavier with each passing season, a weight that pressed down on the conscience of Taney County like the lid of a coffin that no one dared to open. By the turn of the century, the Dowell family had all but vanished from community life. The 1900 census recorded Elias Dowell simply as a widower, with Eliza and Clara still residing at the farmhouse. What the document failed to capture was the profound transformation that had occurred on that lonely ridge above the Ozarks. Reverend John Carter of the Springfield Baptist Church found himself increasingly troubled by their absence. Flipping through the parish registry one Sunday afternoon, he noticed the Dowell girls' names were conspicuously missing from confirmation records. The minister ran his finger down the list of congregants, remembering how Margaret had faithfully brought her daughters each week, their hair neatly braided and dresses pressed despite their modest means. "They need the community now more than ever," the Reverend confided to his wife over supper. "Grief can twist a man's soul if he bears it alone." He resolved to visit the farmstead the following week, but pressing matters in the congregation repeatedly delayed his journey up the ridge. Meanwhile, farmers traveling the winding dirt road past the Dowell property noticed unsettling changes. Jacob Fortin, whose fields bordered Elias's land, observed the homestead's transformation during his early morning rides to market. "Never see those curtains open anymore," Jacob told his wife. "Even on the brightest days, that house sits there like it's perpetually night." After dark, the farmhouse took on an even more peculiar character. Lamps glowed behind thick drapes until the early hours, casting eerie shadows across the overgrown yard. The wagon that had once regularly traveled to town for supplies now appeared only sporadically, with Elias alone at the reins, his daughters nowhere to be seen. Some neighbors, like elderly Martha Simmons, attributed these changes to the natural course of mourning. "A man needs time to heal," she insisted at the general store when others voiced concern. Some wounds cut deeper than others, but others harbored darker suspicions. Thomas and Mary Fletcher, whose farm lay within earshot of the Dowell place, began documenting disturbing observations in their family journal. "Strange noises drift from the Dowell farmhouse after midnight," Mary wrote in the spring of 1900. "Not the sounds of grief, but something that raises the hair on one's neck. Muffled cries that seem neither animal nor fully human." The community's response to these troubling signs revealed a cultural reluctance to interfere in private matters. Even those who suspected something amiss hesitated to approach Sheriff Jennings with mere whispers and unease. Instead, the Dowell homestead became a place that mothers warned their children to avoid, and that men eyed warily as they passed, quickening their horses' pace as the ridge came into view. The night air carried a bitter chill, as Sarah Fields made her way up the winding path to the Dowell farmhouse. Autumn leaves crunched beneath the wheels of her wagon, the sound eerily loud in the stillness that seemed to blanket the ridge. It was well past midnight in October of 1903 when the seasoned midwife had received the urgent summons, not through proper channels, but via a hastily scrawled note delivered by a local boy paid to keep silent about its origins. Sarah had attended hundreds of births throughout Taney County, but something about this call made her uneasy. The Dowell place had become the subject of whispered conversations in Branson, with neighbors exchanging worried glances whenever the family was mentioned. As she approached the weathered farmhouse, Sarah noticed a single lamp burning in an upstairs window. Before she could knock, the door swung open. Elias Dowell stood framed in the doorway, his tall figure blocking any view of the home's interior. His face, half hidden in shadow, betrayed no emotion. "You've come," he stated flatly, taking her medical bag without invitation. "This way." The midwife attempted to move past him toward sounds coming from what she presumed was the front room, but the former's arm shot out, barring her path. "Not there," he commanded. "Upstairs." Confused but bound by professional duty, she followed him up the creaking staircase. The house smelled of wood smoke and something else, a medicinal odor she couldn't quite place. From behind a closed door came the unmistakable whimpers of a woman in labor. "Which one?" Sarah asked quietly. Elias didn't answer, merely pushing open the door to reveal a sparsely furnished bedroom where a young woman lay on sweat-soaked sheets, her face contorted in pain. For 3 hours, Sarah worked in near silence, delivering a tiny, frail infant whose first cries were barely audible. The child, a boy, bore troubling features that spoke of complications beyond mere prematurity. Throughout the ordeal, the mother never spoke, her eyes vacant and distant. When it was over, Elias appeared in the doorway and gestured for Sarah to leave. She protested, insisting the baby needed continued care, but her medical advice fell on deaf ears. As the midwife was escorted out, she glanced toward the parlor window and froze. Two pale faces stared back at her, identical expressions of hollow resignation. The Dowell sisters, watching silently as she was turned away. Back in Branson, Sarah recorded only the barest details in her leather-bound ledger. Child delivered, weak, not seen again. She would keep the rest locked away for decades, until old age loosened her professional discretion, and the weight of secrets became too heavy to bear alone. The crisp morning air carried no hint of what awaited the Tanner brothers that spring day in 1905. James and Robert Tanner had ventured onto the outskirts of the Dowell property in pursuit of wild turkey when James spotted something disturbing the soil near a cluster of blackberry bushes. It looked like something had been digging, Robert Tanner later told Sheriff William Jennings. "We thought it might be a fox den until we saw the tiny hand." What the hunters discovered sent ripples of horror through Taney County. A shallow grave, barely 18 inches deep, contained the remains of an infant wrapped in a faded cotton sheet. The brothers immediately reported their grim finding to the authorities, who dispatched County Coroner Dr. Thomas Whitfield to the scene. The coroner's examination was conducted in the small back room of his Springfield office. His official report, filed in the county records, used clinical language that nonetheless painted a disturbing picture. Male infant, approximately 2 months of age, defective formation evident in cranial structure and limbs, features irregular, suggesting consanguineous parentage. Dr. Whitfield noted the infant had likely died of natural causes related to its congenital deformities, but the circumstances of the burial raised troubling questions. No death certificate had been filed, no clergy called, no proper interment arranged. "The child was simply put in the ground like an animal," one deputy remarked. When questioned, Elias Dowell claimed no knowledge of the infant. His weathered face betrayed nothing as he stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, refusing to allow Sheriff Jennings past the threshold. Behind him, Shadows moved in the darkened hallway. Glimpses of Eliza and Clara, pale figures retreating deeper into the house. "My daughters know nothing of this matter," Elias insisted, his voice steady but cold. "We've had no births here since my wife passed." The coroner, however, had his suspicions. In the margin of his official report, beside the clinical description of the infant's deformities, Dr. Whitfield scrawled a note never intended for public viewing. "Origin suspected. Consistent with offspring of close relation. Dowell situation requires investigation." No charges were filed. Without witnesses willing to speak and no direct evidence linking the infant to the Dowell household, the case remained officially unresolved. But in the general store, at church gatherings, and across dinner tables throughout the county, whispers about the Dowell girls grew sharper and more urgent. The community's unease crystallized into something darker, a collective suspicion that dared not speak its name openly. "Those poor girls," Sarah Fields murmured to Reverend Carter after Sunday service. "What happens behind those walls is between them and God now." The infant was reburied in the county cemetery, unmarked, save for a small stone bearing only the year. It would not be the last such grave. Between 1904 and 1907, the Greene County Almshouse became the silent witness to a disturbing pattern. Dr. Thomas Blackwell, the county physician serving Springfield, documented in his medical journal the arrival of 5 infants with what he clinically described as irregular lineage. His colleague in Branson, Dr. Henry Mills, recorded 3 more such cases during the same period. These children shared troubling similarities: frail bodies, underdeveloped limbs, and facial features that bore an unsettling resemblance to the Dowell sisters. The matron of the almshouse, Mrs. Abigail Wilson, would later confide to Lucy Barton during her research that she had known the Dowell girls in their youth, before their withdrawal from society. "Those poor babies," she had whispered, had the same hollow eyes as Eliza and Clara, like something wasn't quite right beneath the skin. The infants always arrived under cover of darkness. Elias Dowell would appear at the almshouse door, his wagon barely making a sound on the gravel path. The farmer never spoke more than necessary, offering no explanations about the children's origins. He would simply hand over the swaddled bundle to whoever answered the door, tip his hat, and disappear back into the night. Sheriff William Jettings noted in his personal ledger, not his official records, that he had twice observed Elias's wagon heading toward town well after midnight. When questioned casually the following day, the reclusive man claimed he had been delivering produce to early morning markets. The sheriff, lacking evidence for anything more sinister, could only make a notation and harbor his suspicions. Most troubling was the fate of these fragile children. None survived beyond their first year. The almshouse records listed causes ranging from failure to thrive to congenital defects of the heart. They were buried in unmarked graves behind the poor farm, their brief lives documented only as numbers in a registry. Reverend John Carter attempted once to offer proper Christian burial for one of the infants. When he approached Elias after Sunday service, one of the rare occasions the man appeared in town to discuss the matter, the farmer cut him off with a cold stare. "What's dead is dead," he reportedly said before walking away. The few nurses and caretakers who tended these children spoke in hushed tones about their unusual features: webbed fingers on some, misshapen skulls on others. One infant reportedly had eyes of different colors, a detail that would later become part of the Ozark folklore surrounding the Dowell family. Not once did Eliza or Clara come to see these children. Not once did anyone formally claim them as family. They existed briefly, suffered quietly, and disappeared into the earth without ceremony, silent victims of whatever darkness had taken hold on that ridge above the Ozarks. Reverend John Carter's fingers trembled slightly as he dipped his pen into the inkwell. The Springfield Baptist Church's quarterly report demanded his attention, but his mind kept returning to the Dowell family. Spring sunshine streamed through his office window, casting long shadows across the worn wooden desk where church records had accumulated for generations. Brother Dowell permits not his daughters to partake in communion, a matter of concern. He wrote carefully, the scratching of his nib against paper the only sound in the quiet room. The minister paused, considering whether to elaborate. There was more, much more, that troubled him about the family on the ridge, but propriety and uncertainty held his pen. 5 Sundays had passed since he'd last glimpsed Eliza and Clara Dowell. The sisters had once been fixtures at Sunday service, their matching bonnets visible from his pulpit. Now their absence left a conspicuous void in the third pew, where Margaret had once ensured her daughters sat straight-backed and attentive. The Baptist minister closed the leather-bound report book and gazed out toward the distant hills. Since Margaret's passing, Elias had withdrawn his daughters from community life entirely. When the clergyman had called at their farmhouse the previous month, he'd been met with curtains hastily drawn and a door firmly shut. "They're occupied with lessons," Elias had called through the barely cracked door. But Carter had heard no recitation of verses, no scratch of slate pencils, only a strange heavy silence, broken by what sounded like muffled weeping. Mrs. Abernathy, who lived nearest to the Dowell property, had confided in him after last week's service. "Something ain't right up there, Reverend," she'd whispered. "Those girls used to wave when I passed in my wagon. Now the windows are always dark, even when I know they're home." Carter had nodded, his pastoral instincts flaring with concern. "I shall call again," he'd promised. But 3 attempts later, the farmhouse remained as impenetrable as a fortress. Once, he thought he'd seen a pale face at an upstairs window, Clara or Eliza, he couldn't tell which, before a hand pulled the curtain closed. The minister sighed heavily, returning to his report. He considered striking the line about communion, worried it might draw unwanted attention to the family. But something compelled him to leave it, a small record of his growing unease, a breadcrumb for whoever might need to follow this trail. What the dutiful clergyman couldn't know was that his simple notation would become crucial evidence decades later. The historian who eventually discovered it would recognize it as the earliest official documentation of concern, a warning that went unheeded as the tragedy on the ridge unfolded in terrible silence. The autumn of 1911 brought a chill to the Ozarks earlier than usual. Silas Hargrove, a traveling preacher with a worn Bible and threadbare coat, found himself caught in an unexpected downpour while journeying between Springfield and Branson. Seeking shelter, he approached the isolated Dowell farmhouse, a place most locals avoided. Elias Dowell answered the door with obvious reluctance, his weathered face tight with suspicion. The farmer's eyes darted past the preacher to scan the empty road before grudgingly offering lodging for the night. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and something else, a sour undercurrent that made Hargrove uneasy. "My daughters are indisposed," Elias explained curtly when the preacher inquired about the rest of the household. "They keep to themselves." That evening, the traveling minister caught only fleeting glimpses of Eliza and Clara Dowell, pale shadows moving behind partially open doors, their eyes downcast when forced to pass through the kitchen where he sat. Neither spoke a word, though he noticed their furtive glances toward each other, a silent language between them. After a sparse meal, Hargrove was shown to a small room with thin walls and a narrow bed. He read his Bible by candlelight before extinguishing the flame. But sleep proved elusive in the oppressive silence of the house. It was well past midnight when the wailing began, the unmistakable cry of an infant, high-pitched and desperate. The preacher sat bolt upright, listening as Elias's voice rose in anger, though the words were indistinct. A door slammed, followed by hurried footsteps and hushed, pleading voices that could only belong to the sisters. The crying abruptly ceased. By dawn, Silas had packed his few belongings. He thanked his host stiffly, noting how Elias positioned himself to block any view into the house's interior. As the preacher departed, he glanced back to see one of the sisters, Clara, he believed, watching from an upstairs window, her face a mask of resignation. 2 days later, Sheriff William Jennings of Taney County received a sworn statement from the shaken preacher. Hargrove's careful handwriting detailed his observations: the sister's strange behavior, the infant's cries, Elias's rage, and the unnatural silence that followed. "I fear something ungodly occurs in that house," the statement concluded. "Something the Lord would have us bring to light." The sheriff filed the document alongside other whispered concerns about the Dowell household. Unlike previous rumors, however, this testimony came from a man of God, one with nothing to gain and much to risk by speaking out against a family that had lived in these hills for generations. Sheriff William Jennings sat at his oak desk, the lamplight casting shadows across his weathered face as he dipped his pen into the inkwell. For the first time in his 15 years of service to Taney County, he hesitated before writing in the official ledger. The phrase "unnatural relation" felt heavy, permanent. Once committed to paper, it couldn't be undone. The traveling preacher's testimony had been detailed and disturbing. Silas Hargrove had awakened to the unmistakable cries of an infant, followed by Elias Dowell's angry voice through the thin farmhouse walls. What the preacher described hearing next had compelled the sheriff to act where others had merely whispered. "I'm bound by duty," Jennings told his deputy as they rode up the winding path to the ridgetop property. The Dowell homestead looked abandoned in the morning light, curtains drawn despite the spring sunshine, weeds choking what had once been Margaret's flower garden. Elias met them at the door, his face a mask of indignation. "This is Christian persecution," he spat, but the lawman pushed past him, finding Eliza and Clara sitting motionless in the kitchen, their pale faces turned toward the wall. The sisters were brought to the Forsyth courthouse the following day. Clara, the younger of the two, wore a faded dress that hung from her thin frame. Eliza's hands trembled as she clutched her sister's arm. Neither would meet the magistrate's gaze. "Did your father ever?" Judge Thornton couldn't bring himself to finish the question. The courtroom had been cleared, but the walls seemed to lean in, hungry for scandal. The sisters stared at the floorboards. Clara's lips parted once, but Eliza's fingers tightened around her wrist, and silence prevailed. After 3 hours of questioning, not a single word had been uttered by either woman. "Without testimony, we have nothing but hearsay," the judge finally declared, closing his leather-bound notebook with a sigh that spoke volumes. Reverend Hargrove stood in the back of the courtroom, his face ashen. "God will judge what men cannot," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. By week's end, the preacher had packed his belongings and left Missouri altogether, telling the innkeeper he was headed for Arkansas, somewhere the Dowell name means nothing. The case collapsed like a house of playing cards. Sheriff Jennings watched from the courthouse steps as Elias led his daughters back to their wagon, his hand gripping Eliza's upper arm with unmistakable ownership. The lawman made one final entry in his ledger that evening. "Case dismissed. Evidence insufficient. God help those girls." In the months that followed, the Dowell farm retreated further into isolation. Neighbors who had once brought pies after Margaret's passing now crossed to the other side of the road when they saw the wagon approaching. The silence that enveloped the ridge grew deeper, darker, a silence that spoke more truth than any testimony ever could. The Greene County Poor Farm stood at the edge of Springfield like a monument to misfortune, its weathered brick facade housing those whom society had forgotten. Between 1913 and 1915, matron Edith Holloway recorded the arrival of several children in her thick ledger, using a peculiar phrase that would later haunt historians: consanguineous stock. One winter evening in 1914, a wagon arrived after dark. Edith noted how Elias Dowell himself delivered a small girl, no more than 3 years old, her thin body wrapped in a threadbare quilt. The child's spine curved unnaturally beneath her dress, and her features bore an unsettling familiarity that the matron couldn't immediately place. "No name given," Edith wrote in her records. "Father claims distant relation only." The girl never spoke above a whisper. At night, she would stand by the dormitory window, her small fingers pressed against the glass, as if searching for something on the distant ridge. The other children called her Mouse, for her quiet ways and tendency to hide in corners when strangers visited the poorhouse. Dr. James Wilson, who examined the children quarterly, noted the girl's unusual features in his medical journal. Facial structure suggests shared parentage with subtle duplications. Spine malformation consistent with offspring of close relations. His clinical observations stopped short of direct accusation, but his private correspondence with Sheriff Jennings revealed deeper concerns. "The resemblance cannot be ignored," he wrote. "The child bears the features of both Dowell sisters, as if nature attempted to blend them into one face." When questioned, Elias claimed the child belonged to a deceased cousin. The sisters were never present during these rare interactions, remaining shadowy figures on their isolated ridge. The girl survived only 8 months at the poor farm, succumbing to pneumonia during a harsh February. No one claimed her body. She was buried in the pauper's field behind the institution, marked only by a small stone bearing the number 23. Decades later, in 1952, journalist Thomas Becker tracked down Edith Holloway, by then elderly and living with her daughter in Kansas City. Over tea in her modest apartment, she finally spoke freely about the children from the ridge. "There are others before and after," the former matron confided, her hands trembling slightly as she recalled those years. "All with the same haunted eyes, the same twisted limbs. Some lived weeks, others months. None survived to school age." Edith's diary, later donated to the Springfield Historical Society, contained what official records did not: her firm belief that the Dowell sisters had been bearing their father's children for years, with the poorhouse becoming the final repository for those who survived birth. "God forgive us all," she wrote in her final entry about the Dowells, "for we saw and we remained silent." The flames licked at the night sky above Forsyth as the courthouse burned on a bitter cold evening in January 1916. Sheriff William Jennings stood helpless, watching as years of county records turned to ash. Among those irreplaceable documents were the affidavits, witness statements, and preliminary investigations into the Dowell family, evidence that might have one day brought justice to the ridge. "Nothing to be done now," the sheriff muttered to his deputy, as they watched the fire consume the east wing, where the records were stored. The timber structure, built in the previous century, offered little resistance to the hungry flames. The following morning, as smoke still rose from the charred remains, Elias Dowell appeared in town for the first time in months. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Several townspeople later recalled how the farmer seemed almost pleased by the destruction, his weathered face illuminated with an unsettling calm as he surveyed the damage. "Providence has spoken," Elias was overheard saying to the general store owner. "Some matters are best left to God's judgment, not man's law." The timing struck many as suspicious. Just 3 weeks earlier, a new district attorney had requested the Dowell files, intending to review the case that his predecessor had abandoned. Now those files were gone. The sworn statement from Silas Hargrove, the midwife's troubling notes, the coroner's reports on the unnamed infants, all reduced to cinders and smoke. Without documentation, the case against the reclusive farmer effectively vanished. The sisters, Eliza and Clara, retreated further into isolation, their pale faces no longer even glimpsed at windows. The farmhouse on the ridge became like a fortress, with Elias turning away all visitors with a shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. Reverend Carter made one final attempt to visit after the fire, concerned about the sisters' welfare. "The man has changed," the minister wrote in his personal diary that evening. "There is something in his eyes now, not grief, but triumph. I fear for those girls more than ever." The courthouse was eventually rebuilt, but the records could never be recovered. The fire had effectively erased the official memory of the Dowell case, leaving only whispers and rumors in its wake. Some in Taney County suggested the blaze was no accident, though no investigation into arson was ever completed. For the Dowells, the fire represented a kind of liberation, their secrets now protected by the convenient destruction of evidence. Their isolation grew more complete in the years that followed, their story fading into shadow, preserved only in the fading memories of those who had witnessed their strange, silent tragedy. In the late autumn of 1917, Jacob Tanner and his hunting companion stumbled upon what appeared to be freshly disturbed earth while tracking deer near the eastern boundary of the Dowell property. What they found haunted Jacob for years to come. A crude wooden marker and a depression in the soil no larger than a breadbasket. The men crossed themselves and continued on their way, speaking of it to no one but the barkeep at Miller's Tavern that evening. By the following spring, 3 more such sites had been discovered by local farmhands and timber workers. Ezekiel Harper, who delivered supplies to neighboring farms, reported seeing Elias Dowell digging in the pre-dawn hours near the property line, his lantern casting eerie shadows through the mist. The old farmer never acknowledged Ezekiel's wagon passing on the road below. "There's something ungodly about those little plots," whispered Martha Wilkins, whose husband's fields bordered the Dowell land. "No proper Christian burial, no minister called, no neighbors to pay respects." Her voice would drop even lower when adding, "And they're so small, those graves, so very small." Sheriff William Jennings, still troubled by the unresolved investigation years earlier, rode out twice to inspect the reported sites, but found nothing conclusive, just sunken patches of earth with occasional wildflowers growing in unusual abundance. Without evidence of wrongdoing, the lawman could do nothing but note the findings in his personal journal, a document that would later become crucial to historians piecing together the Dowell tragedy. The 1920 federal census taker, a meticulous man named Howard Griffith, recorded only 3 occupants at the Ridgetop farmhouse: Elias, age 63, and his daughters Eliza and Clara, 36 and 34, respectively. When Griffith inquired about other household members, the sisters remained seated at the kitchen table, eyes downcast, while their father tersely answered questions from the doorway, never inviting the census taker inside. "No children here," Elias stated flatly. "Just us 3 since my Margaret passed." Griffith later confided to Reverend John Carter that the farmhouse had fallen into disrepair, with broken windows patched with oilcloth and weeds overtaking what had once been Margaret Dowell's carefully tended garden. The census taker also noted the sisters' appearance, gaunt and prematurely aged, their movements mechanical as they went about preparing the evening meal. As the decade drew to a close, the small, unmarked graves multiplied along the property's edge, a silent testimony to secrets the community acknowledged only in whispers. Children were warned to stay clear of the Dowell Ridge, and hunters gave the eastern boundary a wide berth, crossing themselves when passing the spots where wildflowers grew in unnatural abundance. By the early 1930s, the Dowell farm had deteriorated beyond recognition. The once pristine homestead that had stood proudly on the ridge above the Ozarks now resembled a decaying tooth in an otherwise rolling green landscape. Windows that had once concealed the family's secrets now hung shattered from their frames, inviting the elements to consume what remained of the Dowell legacy. Neighbors who passed by on their way to Springfield or Branson would cross themselves at the site. The fields that Elias Dowell had once meticulously tended lay choked with weeds and brambles. the fences collapsing under the weight of wild grapevines. The wagon that had occasionally carried him to town sat rotting beside the barn, its wheels sinking slowly into the Missouri soil. In the winter of 1932, a chimney fire briefly illuminated the ridge. By the time the nearest farmers arrived to help, they found Elias dead in his rocking chair, a Bible open on his lap. He was buried without ceremony in the family plot, no minister present to offer final words. The county clerk recorded his passing with a single line in the death registry: Elias Dowell, farmer, age 74. For weeks afterward, smoke could still be seen rising from the farmhouse chimney. Locals whispered that Eliza and Clara remained, two pale ghosts moving behind curtained windows. Then one day, no smoke appeared. The sisters had seemingly vanished like morning mist over the Ozark valleys. Sheriff Thomas Blackwell, who had replaced William Jennings years before, rode up to investigate after concerned reports from a passing peddler. He found the house empty, dust settling over abandoned belongings. Two beds remained neatly made in the sisters' room, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment. In the kitchen, plates sat washed and stacked, waiting for hands that would never return. No record of their departure existed. No train conductor remembered two middle-aged women boarding in Springfield or Branson. No neighboring county reported their arrival. Like their mother before them, Eliza and Clara Dowell simply ceased to exist in the public record. The Dowell property fell into tax delinquency by 1935. When county officials finally auctioned the land, no locals would bid. The parcel was eventually purchased by a timber company from Kansas City, whose workers refused to fell trees near the house or the scattered depressions that marked the unmarked graves. The sisters' story might have ended there, buried beneath decades of silence and superstition, had it not been for the persistent curiosity of a young academic who would soon uncover fragments of their tragic existence. But for now, the Dowell name existed only in whispered warnings parents gave to children who strayed too close to the abandoned ridge. In the autumn of 1934, Lucy Barton, a determined graduate student at Drury College, found herself hunched over yellowing medical records in the dusty archives of Greene County Hospital. What began as research for her thesis on rural healthcare practices quickly transformed into something far more disturbing. Between faded ink and water stains, Lucy noticed a pattern: repeated notations of defective stock and consanguineous offspring, appearing in county medical ledgers between 1903 and 1916. The young researcher traced these clinical euphemisms back to a handful of infants, all documented with similar physical abnormalities. Intrigued, she expanded her search to church records, newspaper archives, and courthouse documents that had survived the Forsyth Fire. Her persistence led to a remarkable discovery in the personal effects of a former county clerk: a packet of letters written by Reverend Silas Hargrove. The Dowell household stands as a testament to grief turned inward. Hargrove had written to Sheriff Jennings in 1911. But beneath that grief lies something darker, a sin I dare not name in writing. The preacher described hearing an infant's cries during his stay, followed by Elias's angry voice and the sisters' muffled sobs. In a later letter, he confessed his suspicion that unholy relations existed within those walls, with Elias as both father and grandfather to children who rarely survived infancy. Lucy tracked down Sarah Fields, now elderly and living with her daughter in Branson. The midwife, her hands twisted with arthritis, but her memory still sharp, confirmed what the letters suggested. "I delivered 3 babies to that house," she whispered to the student. "Never saw the mothers proper, but I knew. Those poor girls, their eyes were dead already." The academic community initially dismissed Lucy's findings as sensationalism. Her thesis advisor cautioned against pursuing such unsavory local folklore. But when she published a carefully documented article in the Missouri Historical Review, elderly residents of Taney County began coming forward with their own recollections. "We all knew," admitted one former neighbor, now in his 70s. "But in those days, you didn't meddle in family business, especially not with a man like Elias Dowell." Lucy's research coincided with the passing of the last generation who had witnessed the Dowell tragedy firsthand. Her meticulous work preserved testimonies that would otherwise have been lost forever. Though academic recognition eluded her, the subject matter was deemed too controversial for serious historical consideration. Her papers eventually formed the foundation of what scholars would later recognize as a crucial case study in rural isolation and familial abuse. The young researcher had pulled back the veil of silence just as it threatened to become permanent, exposing the terrible truth of what had transpired on that lonely Ozark Ridge. By the late 1920s, the Dowell homestead had faded into local legend. Oral historians from the University of Missouri began traveling through the Ozarks, recording the memories of elderly residents who remembered the strange family that once lived on the ridge above Taney County. Martha Jenkins, then 83, recalled seeing Eliza and Clara Dowell as a child. "They were like ghosts," she whispered into the researcher's recording device. "Pale as moonlight, with eyes that followed you even when they didn't move. Sometimes at dusk, you'd see them pressed against the windows, watching the world they couldn't touch." The sisters had become spectral figures in the collective memory of Springfield and Branson. Children walking home from the schoolhouse would take the long way around to avoid passing the Dowell property. Parents used the family as cautionary tales, though they never specified what exactly the caution was against. "We all knew," confided Thomas Blackwell, a former farmhand who had delivered supplies to the Dowell farm. "Nobody said it out loud, but we knew what Elias was doing to those girls. The evidence was in those sickly children that kept appearing and disappearing. In hushed conversations behind closed doors, the word inbred was passed like a terrible secret. The older generation would fall silent when younger ears approached." Preserving the horror through selective silence rather than open discussion, Reverend Michael Thornton, who succeeded John Carter at the Springfield Baptist Church, found notes in the parish records describing the unfortunate Dowell situation without elaboration. The previous generation believed some things were better left unspoken, he explained to researchers, but their silence allowed the tragedy to continue. Local folklore transformed the Dowell sisters into something between victims and monsters. Children claimed to hear wailing from the abandoned farmhouse decades after the family had gone. Hunters swore they saw two pale women walking among the unmarked graves at twilight. Lucy Barton's academic work in the 30s gave substance to these ghost stories. Her research connected the fragments of evidence, the midwife's records, the sheriff's incomplete investigation, the coroner's cryptic notes about infants of irregular formation. "What makes the Dowell case so haunting," wrote Barton in her thesis, "is not just the horror of what happened, but how an entire community recognized the signs and chose to look away. The sisters were visible enough to become legends, yet invisible enough that no one saved them." The legend of the Dowell sisters grew, twisted by time and retelling, but at its core remained the truth. Two women trapped in a nightmare, their faces pressed against windows, watching freedom they would never know, while bearing children whose brief lives became footnotes in a story the Ozarks could never forget, but rarely spoke aloud. The fragmented evidence of the Dowell tragedy resembled a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting only a portion of the horror that had unfolded on that Ozark Ridge. By the late 1930s, most official documentation had been consumed by the Forsyth Courthouse fire, or simply lost to decades of neglect. What remained? Your disparate pieces that historians and curious locals struggled to assemble into a coherent narrative. Sarah Field's midwife diary, yellowed and water-stained, contained only cryptic entries about her visits to the Dowell farmhouse. Called to attend ED again, one entry read. Father insistent on privacy. Child malformed. God have mercy. The seasoned midwife had taken these observations to her grave, speaking of them only in whispers during her final days at the Greene County almshouse. The coroner's notes, preserved by chance in a separate filing cabinet that survived the courthouse fire, documented several infant deaths with clinical detachment. Subject displays characteristics consistent with consanguinity, read one report from 1911. The medical terminology masked a more disturbing truth that no official dared state explicitly in writing. Reverend Hargrove's letters to Sheriff Jennings, discovered in a trunk of personal effects after the preacher's death in Tennessee, provided the most damning testimony. I heard sounds no Christian home should harbor, he wrote. The father's voice commanding silence, the sisters weeping in unison, and always, always the mewling of infants born of sin too terrible to name. Lucy Barton's research at Drury College compiled these fragments alongside oral testimonies from aging neighbors who remembered the Dowell sisters. They were like ghosts, recalled one elderly woman who had lived down the valley. Sometimes I'd see them at the window, both watching, never apart. Their faces so alike you couldn't tell which was Eliza and which was Clara. Most heartbreaking were the scattered memories of the children themselves, brief lives documented only in hurried baptismal records or poorhouse admittance forms. Child of unknown parentage, read one such form, exhibits characteristics of both Dowell sisters. These children, products of unnatural unions, lived briefly and painfully, their existence acknowledged only in fragments of paper and whispered memories. Together, these remnants formed a mosaic of tragedy. A father who had twisted grief into something monstrous, daughters imprisoned by isolation and abuse, and children born of that darkness who never had a chance at life. The fragments couldn't reveal every detail of what happened behind those shuttered windows, but they painted a picture clear enough to haunt the Ozarks for generations. What the records couldn't capture was the weight of communal guilt, the knowledge that while papers burned and memories faded, an entire community had turned away when the Dowell sisters needed rescue most. Decades after the Dowell tragedy faded from local headlines, the weight of collective guilt settled over Taney County like morning fog on the Ozark Ridges. In a series of oral history interviews conducted by Lucy Barton in the late 30s, elderly residents finally gave voice to what had long been whispered behind closed doors. Martha Jenkins, who had lived just 3 miles from the Dowell farmhouse, confessed with trembling hands, "We all knew something wasn't right up there. The way Elias kept those girls hidden away after Margaret passed. The way they'd sometimes appear at the window like ghosts." The elderly woman's eyes clouded with regret. But questioning your neighbor's business wasn't our way. This sentiment echoed throughout the community. Former Sheriff William Jennings, by then retired and suffering from arthritis, admitted that local custom had effectively paralyzed official intervention. Without those girls speaking up, the law couldn't touch Elias, he explained. And folks around here, they'd rather pretend not to see than face something so unnatural. Reverend Carter's successor at Springfield Baptist Church, reviewing the old parish records, discovered notes where his predecessor had written of his concerns. A community that turns from wickedness becomes complicit in it, the yellowed pages read, a damning indictment of collective silence. The burden of knowledge without action weighed heaviest on Sarah Fields. The midwife, in her final days, confided to her apprentice about the night at the Dowell farm. "I knew those babies weren't right," she whispered. "I should have done more than just write it in my ledger." What emerged from these belated confessions was a portrait of a community trapped between suspicion and tradition. Farmers who had glimpsed strange movements on the ridge at night admitted they deliberately avoided the Dowell property. shopkeepers recalled how they'd served Elias without meeting his eyes, taking his money, and asking no questions about the daughters no one ever saw. It wasn't just Elias who built walls around those girls, one elderly man reflected. We all did, brick by brick, with our silence. The shame of inaction became Taney County's inheritance, a stain that couldn't be washed away by courthouse fires or the passage of time. As one resident put it, some sins belong to one man alone, but the Dowell tragedy? That shame belongs to all of us who looked away when those girls needed someone to see them. The soil of the Ozarks has always kept secrets well. Even today, nearly a century after the Dowell family faded from living memory, hikers and hunters traversing the overgrown property occasionally stumble upon strange depressions in the earth. These sunken patches, scattered across the ridge where the farmhouse once stood, appear almost deliberate in their arrangement, too uniform to be natural, too numerous to ignore. Local guide Thomas Whitaker, whose grandfather once delivered supplies to the Dowell farm, points them out with a solemn gesture. See how the wildflowers grow thicker there? Bluestem and coneflowers cluster in those spots like nowhere else on the ridge. He explains, keeping a respectful distance. The old folks say it's because of what lies beneath. What lies beneath, according to generations of Taney County residents, are the forgotten graves of children born to the Dowell sisters. Children whose existence was barely acknowledged in life and deliberately obscured in death. No wooden crosses mark these final resting places. No names were recorded in church registries. They remain anonymous beneath layers of Missouri clay and decades of silence. Forensic archaeologists from the University of Missouri have expressed interest in examining these sites, but local resistance has been strong. Some things are better left buried, insists Martha Jenkins, whose family has owned neighboring property since the 1940s. Those children suffered enough. The graves tell a story the written record could not preserve. While courthouse fires destroyed official documents and community silence obscured the truth, these small patches of earth remain as physical testimony to what happened on the ridge. Each spring they bloom with unexpected vigor, as if something beneath the soil feeds the roots with particular intensity. Hunters avoid these spots, claiming their dogs grow agitated and refuse to cross them. Local teenagers, testing their courage on moonlit nights, report cold spots and whispers where the wildflowers grow thickest. Whether these are merely stories born of suggestion or something more remains as much a mystery as the exact number of children buried on the ridge. The land remembers what people try to forget, says Whitaker, watching as wind ripples through the tall grass covering what might be the smallest of the graves. These children never had names, never had markers, but the earth holds them anyway. The Dowell sisters' story might have been lost if not for these places where the ground never quite settles and the flowers grow too bright. Unmarked and untended, these graves remain the most tangible evidence of the tragedy that unfolded in the farmhouse above the Ozarks. Silent witnesses to secrets that the community tried and ultimately failed to bury alongside the children. By the late 1950s, fragments of the Dowell story began to emerge from dusty archives and fading memories. Lucy Barton's research, once dismissed as sensationalism, found new life when a young historian from Drury College discovered her notes tucked away in the college library's special collections. The yellowed pages contained interviews with elderly residents who had been children when the Dowell sisters still lived on the ridge. "We weren't supposed to talk about it," one 80-year-old woman had told Lucy. "My mother would cross herself whenever we passed that farm, though we weren't even Catholic." As oral historians fanned out across Taney County, recording the memories of the area's oldest residents, a pattern emerged. The stories, told in hushed tones over kitchen tables and on sagging front porches, shared common elements: children with twisted limbs, Elias Dowell's midnight visits to the almshouse, and the sisters' faces at the windows, pale and watching. Sheriff William Jennings' grandson, now a judge himself, discovered a small leather-bound notebook in his grandfather's effects. The pages contained what the old sheriff couldn't officially document: his personal observations about the Dowell case and his frustration at being unable to protect the sisters. "I knew," the sheriff had written, "but could not prove." The girls would not speak against their father, and without their testimony, the law was powerless. Sarah Field's midwifery records, preserved by her granddaughter, provided clinical evidence of what many had suspected. The experienced midwife had documented births at the Dowell farm with coded notations about familiar features and hereditary complications that, to medical professionals reviewing them decades later, clearly indicated inbreeding. Reverend Carter's church records, when cross-referenced with county death certificates, revealed a pattern of infant deaths, all connected to the Ridgetop farm through carefully veiled language. The silence that had protected Elias Dowell and buried the sisters' suffering was finally breaking. Academic papers were published. Local historians organized symposiums. The Springfield Republican ran a feature series on the forgotten tragedy of the Ozarks. The children born of this horror, those buried in unmarked graves, and those who briefly survived in institutions, became silent witnesses in death as they had been in life. Their existence, once denied and hidden, now stood as irrefutable evidence of the crimes committed on the ridge. What had once been whispered became spoken. What had been individual suspicion became collective acknowledgement. The tragedy of Eliza and Clara Dowell emerged from shadow into historical record. Too late for justice, but not too late for truth. The Dowell sisters never left the ridge. Their bodies, like their secrets, remained buried in the soil of Taney County, forgotten by most as decades passed. Their farmhouse crumbled, reclaimed by the persistent Ozark wilderness, until only stone foundations marked where their tragedy had unfolded. Lucy Barton's research in the 1930s sparked a brief flurry of interest, but without conclusive evidence, the case faded once more. The graduate student from Drury College had pieced together fragments from midwife Sarah Field's diary and the surviving portions of Sheriff Jennings' records, creating the first coherent narrative of what had transpired on that isolated ridge. What happened to the Dowell girls wasn't just a family tragedy, Lucy wrote in her thesis, but a community failure, a collective turning away from what everyone suspected but no one would name. The scattered graves discovered throughout the property told their own silent story. Forensic examination of remains found in the 1970s confirmed what many had long suspected. Children born of incestuous relations, many with congenital deformities consistent with consanguineous parentage. The coroner's notes from those early graves, describing defective formation and irregular features, had been tragically accurate. Eliza and Clara's story eventually became part of Ozark folklore, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. Local historians documented how Elias Dowell, consumed by grief after Margaret's death, had withdrawn his daughters from society, eventually forcing them into an unthinkable situation that produced multiple pregnancies and births over nearly 2 decades. Reverend Carter's church records, rediscovered in an archive in Springfield, revealed his growing concern about the family's absence from congregation life. "I fear for the souls in that household," he had written in 1904, "but my entreaties find only closed doors." The traveling preacher Silas Hargrove's testimony, preserved in a letter to his bishop, provided the most damning evidence. "What I witnessed in that house haunts my dreams," he wrote. "The father's control over those poor girls was complete, their spirits broken beyond recognition." Today, the Dowell case is studied by sociologists and psychologists as an extreme example of isolation-enabling abuse. The sisters themselves, pale, silent, and withdrawn, left no writings, no testimonies, no voices of their own. Their legacy lives only through others' observations and the physical evidence of their suffering. The tragedy of Eliza and Clara Dowell serves as a stark reminder that evil flourishes not only through action but inaction, through a community's unwillingness to confront uncomfortable truths, through systems that fail the vulnerable, and through the terrible power of silence maintained across generations.